So this talk this evening, welcome to everybody listening now and in the future. This is part of our professional lecture series from experts. And I'm very pleased to introduce my friend Marilyn Sanders, who's written a new book with someone named George Thompson. But I'm going to read you who Marilyn Sanders is. And before I do that, though, I would just like to say that Dr. Marilyn Sanders is an expert in the polyvagal theory and was very, very generous and kind, and has really been pivotal in, our connections throughout the online school, helping us understand polyvagal theory's impact on prematurity and on human development. So tonight we are discussing her new book, which is The Polyvagal Theory and the Developing Child, Systems of Care for Strengthening Kids, Families, and Communities. So this is her book here. And Dr. Marilyn Sanders is a board-certified pediatrician and neonatologist who cares for critically ill babies, infants, and their families at the Connecticut Children's Medical Center Newborn Intensive Care Unit in Hartford, Connecticut. Dr. Sanders did her pediatric residency at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine and her fellowship in the neonatal perinatal medicine at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. She is a professor of pediatrics at the University of Connecticut School of Medicine. She also provides neurodevelopmental follow-up for babies and infants up to 3 years old. Her scholarly interest is providing trauma-informed care to hospitalized newborns, infants, young children, and their families. Her focus is on the impact of the autonomic nervous system's sense of safety, danger, or life threat on our emotions and behavior. She lectures throughout the United States and Europe. She's authored papers and book chapters on trauma-informed care for young infants, children, and their families in the hospital setting. So I think that about does it. Thank you for coming, Dr. Sanders. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight you so that everyone can see you. And why don't you just go ahead and
Sure.
introduce yourself and your book.
Sure. So to make this a little easier in terms of hearing about the book, I actually prepared a few PowerPoint slides, which we'll get through rather quickly because I'm extremely interested in talking to you, hearing from you, answering your questions. So as Kate told you, my book is entitled Polyvagal Theory and the Developing Child, Systems of Care for Strengthening Kids, Families, and Communities. I think Kate told you about me. I don't need to tell you anymore. I think it's helpful to understand how I found polyvagal theory because it's really part of the journey that brought me to writing the book. Somebody who's sitting out there probably will write a book someday. And I think it's helpful to hear how somebody else came to a book. So I first heard about polyvagal theory in 2012 when a friend of mine handed me a copy of Steve Porges' book and asked me if I would write a review of it for his journal. The friend happens to be a clinical psychologist. And as soon as I began reading Steve's first book, I understood that this was an organizational framework for the way I had practiced over the years, and really an organizational principle, an organizing principle for mammalian behavior. Needless to say, I was thrilled to see that there was someone who was grounded in neuroscience who provided an evidence basis for so many things that I had felt viscerally about the babies I cared for, their families, and the care that I provided, but did not necessarily have the evidence basis. Well, shortly after that, I was fortunate to meet Steve Porges, and we stayed in contact over the next few years. And as time went on, I did write some articles and some chapters, both independently and for Steve in one of his books, in his clinical applications book. But I felt very strongly that there was a lot more to say about polyvagal theory and the child than I could contain in any article or chapter in a book. So in 2018, I submitted a proposal to W.W. Norton, which has published all of Steve's books and Deb Dana's books. And that proposal was accepted. But the interesting thing about that proposal was that rather than simply sticking to the newborn and early childhood, Norton wanted me to talk about childhood from birth to 18 or 21 years of age. And so because of that, I needed to take on a co-author because my expertise is really in early childhood. And I was very fortunate that I had already met George Thompson. George is a child psychiatrist who has spent the majority of his career working in residential care for children who are very seriously mentally ill. And like my babies, who really are unprepared to go out into the world, the children that he cares for are unprepared to go out into the world. Thus, they have ended up in residential care. And so we really had a very good working relationship, and our backgrounds complemented each other's beautifully. And I'm happy to tell you that on November 16th, the book was published. Oops, where are we going? Oops. So you might ask yourself, why this book? And I think I said it in this sentence from the introduction to the book. When we, meaning George and I, learned about Stephen Porges' Polyvagal Theory, we recognized it as a powerful organizing principle, a new way of understanding relationships, a way that validated what we had observed and sometimes challenged what we previously assumed or were told. It's important to keep in mind that George and I are both white, allopathically trained physicians. And by allopathically I mean that we were trained in traditional medical schools with traditional medical school curricula. And so understanding polyvagal theory and applying polyvagal theory forced us to rethink a number of things that we had been taught about the autonomic or unconscious nervous system. So I'm just going to very quickly take you through the book, the sections in the book, what the particular chapters are trying to do. And then Kate, I think, has some questions to get things started, and we'll open it up to questions from you. So the first part of the book is really about the underlying neurobiology, neurophysiology, and brain development that sets the stage for the rest of the book. So as a neonatologist, needless to say, I'm very focused on helping families and helping babies try to ensure that despite the risks that may come with either prematurity or whatever it was that brought them to the newborn intensive care unit, that every child has as good an outcome as he or she can possibly have. So the first chapter is called Nurturing a Brain Under Construction, because that's what the young infant is, a brain under construction. And when you look at the babies who are born and end up in newborn intensive care units, which is where I spend the majority of my time. I do some well-born care, but the vast majority is with critically ill babies. You see a baby whose brain is still in a very, very active stage of development. Then we're taking this baby from his eco niche, putting the baby in the lights and sounds and activity and everything that we encounter in a modern newborn intensive care unit. And the question then becomes, of course, how can we try to meet that baby's biological expectancies in this very unnatural environment? And for those of you who know this field well, I will tell you that I have been heavily influenced by Heidelise Als. I met her in the 1980s. And the newborn individualized developmental care and assessment program is very much a part of the framework that I deliver to the babies for whom I care. The second chapter is really about the parental environment as the second womb. So we know that when the baby is in utero, it is really the womb, the uterus, the fluid that provide the sensory environment to which the baby is exposed. Once the baby comes outside, it's really the parental environment and anyone else that the parents bring into that environment that become the critical factors in the child's experience, and we all know that it is experience that drives brain development and function. The third chapter in that first section is really about how we help our children prepare to go out in the world. So we can only protect them for so long, and to overprotect children, to try and protect them from all stress, is really as harmful as exposing a child to undue stress, because it's the exposures to the tiny little stresses of early childhood, to novelty, for example, which always brings stress along with it, that prepares them to go out into the larger world, be it school or the community. In the second section, we do a bit of an about face. And rather than talking about the idealized environment, which of course would be the healthy child who is well scaffolded in a family where parents are well regulated and co-regulate each other and the baby, we talk about the common and often tragic disruptions of social connectedness that we see in our world today. So we talk about traumatic separations that impact childhood experience. So in addition to things like prematurity, for example, which is clearly a disruption, we talk about things like the migrant crisis. We talk about parental incarceration, parents who have serious underlying mental health issues that interfere with their ability to form relationships with their children, parents who have substance use issues. I mean, the list, unfortunately, is quite lengthy, and look at not only the dimensions of those, which are really quite striking, even in the United States, much less the world. And we're focused predominantly on the environment in the United States to date. But specifically, what kinds of outcomes do we potentially see in children who come from those environments? One that is particularly poignant, that really affected me, was reading about children whose parents are incarcerated, and reading a qualitative analysis in which a 15-year-old boy talked about how they would allow him to see his mother, but not to have any physical contact with her, and how he was, this yearning that he had just to be able to touch his own mother. Imagine the impact, probably speaks to the connection he had to her from early on, but just imagine that kind of impact has on a young mind. And then we talk about the impact of chronic disruptions of connectedness from a lifespan perspective. So we go into things like the ACEs study and Feliti's work. We look at the impact of early childhood adverse experiences on a lifetime of poor health. We look at any number of different, we looked at the Barker work, for example, and think about how all of these interruptions of what our biological expectations are early in life set the stage for many of the chronic illnesses and conditions and challenges that older children and adults face. The last two sections are really oriented toward what I just call child serving professionals. And I think you can fill in that blank in any way you want to. We talk specifically, for example, about physicians, therapists, teachers, advanced practitioners, a whole world of possibilities of individuals who interact with children and their families, and how an understanding of polyvagal theory and moving from what we tend to have as our sort of underlying theme of what's wrong with someone to instead what happened to someone. And just imagine if you are on the other side of that, how differently it feels to have a caregiver who, rather than wanting to have castigate you for whatever it is that you may have done that ended you up in fill in the blank, in prison, in a substance use program, in an inpatient mental health system, whatever the case may be, what were the factors, or in this case, Kate, what was the caravan of risk passageways that ended you up in the situation in which you are in the present? And it's one of the things that I like to think about very dramatically when I'm working with families in the NICU, because it's so helpful for me to have an understanding of what were the factors that together and in combination and perhaps even synergistically and exponentially brought the face I may see to the NICU today. And of course, an important part of that, and that's actually the first chapter in this section, is the question of self-regulation. So how can we use polyvagal theory as child-serving professionals to regulate ourselves so that we are then available to regulate the children and families with whom we work? And for any of you who know anything about medicine or watch Grey's Anatomy or any of those other things, you know that sort of the old mantra in medicine is, what's the first thing you do in a cardiac arrest or code? You take your own pulse. Because if you're not regulated, you certainly can't regulate anyone else you're with. If you're not regulated, for example, as a team leader in a code, you are not going to be able to give your team the direction they need. And many of you work in situations, I am sure, where the crisis level is such that it's almost an ongoing code, although obviously not in the sense of somebody's heart stopping. And then at the end of that section, George has written a positively beautiful chapter about the polyvagal informed organization. So if you want to embed polyvagal theory in your organization, how do you do it? What are the steps? And he uses an example of what he calls a residential treatment center named In Good Hands, and builds the story of a mother, a foster mother actually, who is bringing her foster child to In Good Hands, which is a residential center, because his behavior in the home has become more than the family is able to manage. And then the final section, embodying polyvagal theory in life and in the world, really came out of experiences over the last couple of years. So George and I were writing this book in 2019 and 2020. And there were a couple of very dramatic things that happened, as we all know, in those years. The COVID pandemic hit, and George Floyd was murdered. And the impact of those two events, if you want to call the pandemic an event, but extended period of time, had a very dramatic impact on George and me. And even though the book was almost finished, for example, I went back and wrote a chapter on social connectedness in the time of COVID-19, because it seemed that to publish a book in 2021 and not talk about COVID would be a grave error. And we also, in the course of writing the book, made with great intention, incorporated as much as we could as two Caucasian physicians. And I want to be very clear about that, because I think in this world, it's extremely challenging to write about racism. And we were very much aware that we are two white doctors from middle-class backgrounds trying to talk about this horrible event that had happened, and where we saw implicit bias, structural racism, transgenerational epigenetic changes associated with racism, and how these fit into the opportunities to use polyvagal theory to improve health and well-being. So I'll stop at that point. That is sort of just a very brief outline of the book. If you are interested, on Amazon, you can actually look at the table of contents And you can read, I believe, the introduction and a good portion. Steve Porges wrote the foreword. You can read his foreword. You can read the introduction, and you can read a fair amount of chapter 1 as well. So I encourage you to take a look, see if it's something you're interested in. So I'm going to stop sharing at this point, Kate.
Okay.
Come back to you.
Okay, great. Well, I'm going to remove the spotlight so we can see everybody. And if anybody has a question, wants to raise a hand, wants to participate in a discussion with Dr. Marilyn Sanders, I'll be looking around. I think I can fit all of you on my screen. And you can also use the hand raise button, which is underneath reactions in the bottom. You can just push the hand raise. So both Marilyn, Dr. Sanders and I will be watching for your hands. But I do have some things that on my mind that I wanted to talk to you about, Dr. Sanders. And first of all, thank you so very much for writing this book and for being sort of a forward-thinking person, really trying to integrate polyvagal theory into our world. And I think I first heard about it in 1999, which was like the polyvagal theory came through the craniosacral therapy really early, because a couple of our instructors really heard it and got it. And because we're studying cranial nerves, I mean, they were keeping on top of some of the latest things. So we learned about the social engagement system. I still don't think it's sunk in until well after the year 2000, the importance of this this theory. And I love that some of the phrasing that you've taught me has been, it's called the science of connectivity. And I'm wondering, Dr. Sanders, if you could just say a few words just about that, because I feel like if people are on this call, like sometimes you say polyvagal theory, it's like, what? But if you say the science of connectivity, there's a way that turn of phrase can really give you a place to stand, or something that you can use as a lever if you're trying to convince or work with the population about what is health. So I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about the science of connectivity.
Sure. So as we think about evolution and think about sort of what traditionally has been said about evolution, the survival of the fittest. That's sort of the catchphrase that most of us came out of our high school or college biology with. But when you look at our world from an evolutionary standpoint, and you look at how vertebrates responded to threat, you know that the earliest vertebrates basically had reptiles who came on land, had only one option when they felt threat, which was just to collapse, to blend in, to be as small as they could possibly be. A little later, when we got to a higher level of vertebrates and they sensed threat, then the sympathetic nervous system came online. So the opportunity to essentially either stand in place and fight or flee was there if threat was sensed. But it's only in mammals that we use our social engagement system when we feel threatened. And only when our social engagement system is overwhelmed do we revert to the lower order of sympathetic mobilization or collapse. So, and when you think about this, there's probably no better example of this than a small child who's well attached. What does a small child do when they're afraid? They look to their parent, they look to their grandmother, they look to whomever is familiar to whom they are attached to provide them with a sense of safety. Well, there's a lot of science behind this science of connectivity, and most of it has to do with this wonderful nerve called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve starts in our brainstem and has branches that go to many, many organs in the body, both above the diaphragm and below the diaphragm. And it is very clear that when the vagus nerve is um, in when the tone in the vagus nerve is very good and very high, that people feel better, they are more productive, they can focus better and attend to what's going on around them, they can cooperate. All of these things that are essentially related to the social engagement system. And probably the single most important thing about this is that that vagus nerve directly impacts your heart function. And so when all is well and the vagus nerve is working well, you have this nice, steady heart rate. You're pink, you're well perfused, all of those things. But when there's a disruption and when you can't use your social engagement system to make you feel safe and secure again, then all sorts of heck breaks loose. All of those neurotransmitters start going, and the catecholamines start going, and the cortisol starts going. And those are things that, as we know, are important to help us cope with short-term stressors. But if they are going on chronically, if you have cortisol surges chronically, is actually very detrimental to the brain and to overall health. Does that help?
Yes, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the languaging and how we can think about it. And to our science, the science of connectivity, it is like, for me, it's been a bridge between helping people understand the body and the body's responses and how it looks out in the world. And instead of saying polyvagal theory, I've started just saying the science of connectivity.
And
And
it's
it
the same
helps.
thing. It's the same thing. For example, many people know the book Compassionomics. And if you know Compassionomics, and actually written by two doctors, you know that that's very much focused on strong and efficient vagal nerve function.
Yeah, I have kept Compassionomics. I don't think I've read all of it, but certainly the field of compassion you can begin then to couple the science of connectivity or the vagus with compassion for sure. And before I ask anybody if they have a question, because I certainly have an agenda, I wanted just to do a little bit of myth busting with you, Dr. Sanders. Because I work with babies and I study with baby practitioners, I've had over the years teachers who have just said to me that babies do not have a fight response or a flight response. And true, babies can't punch, or at least they can't punch in a way that would be like victorious. But I have had babies reach out and push my hand away. Or they can't run away. But I wanted just to see, like, if you would be willing to talk a little bit about the baby's capacity and
Sure.
what you've seen in the NICU. Babies do have fight responses, right, Dr. Sanders?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. They cannot get up off the crib, but depending upon the baby, you see it in a number of different ways. So, for example, with the very young babies that I see, you might see it in changes in their vital signs. So you may have a baby who's looking pink and well perfused and has a nice regular heart rate and a normal blood pressure, and then something disrupts that baby. It could be that the baby was comfortable on the mother's chest and is now being put back into the incubator. It could be that somebody has had to do a painful procedure on the baby. You see the vital signs change. You see the baby cry, which is a sign of protest. You may see the baby having very discoordinated, purposeless movements. That's fight and flight for a baby. Older children, slightly older children, will avert their gaze. So, for example, many of you probably know Ed Tronick's beautiful still face video. And when you look at the still face video, and for those who don't, the mother, a mother with a healthy baby interacts with her baby, everything is all good. And then the mother turns, and when she comes back to the baby, she has a still face. It doesn't take that baby 15 seconds to recognize that. And that baby first does things like try to get joint attention with the mother, and gradually becomes more and more upset and looks away. Gaze aversion is flight, right? It's flight.
Yeah.
And then, so that people don't think that this is baby torture, that lasts 2 minutes. And then the mother comes back to the baby, interacts normally with the baby, and for the healthy baby who's got, good scaffolding, the baby comes back very quickly. But it's, if you do nothing else after you hang up tonight, and if you have never seen the still face video, please search it, because it's absolutely a sentinel piece of work in our field.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. All right. Well, I definitely have other things I want to talk about, but I'm going to open it up to see if anybody has any questions for Dr. Sanders about her book, or about her work, about her understanding, how translating this polyvagal theory into practice for working with babies, families. Sheila.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Hi, doctor.
Hello.
How extensively, I think you said when you realized that the Floyd case needed to be written about, how broad are you covering that and taking it into political systems in the book?
We're not.
Okay.
Because it is not a political book. Okay. And that was a really hard decision that we had to make. I think there is clearly a need for such a book, but we are two physicians. And so what we talk about in the book are things like how implicit bias develops, and how to recognize implicit bias in our setting. We talk about things, for example, like the fact that if you look at who sets the research agenda for the United States, which is the National Institutes of Health, overwhelmingly white and Asian male physicians. Very, very few persons of color who are on the study sections or who are directors of sections. So we tried in what we thought was a responsible way to bring those issues to light.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Sheila. Anyone else would like to ask a question? Rebecca. Oh, we can't hear you. Check your microphone. I know you I see you're unmuted, so it must be the microphone. If you could choose the right microphone or turn your volume up or something. So check your audio settings.
How about now?
There
Good.
you go.
Wonderful. Sorry about that. I was switching from headphones to not.
Yeah.
Dr. Sanders, I was curious, you were talking a lot about that, the heart rate and how that impacts everything. I was also curious about the gut-brain connection, and if you address any of that in your book or have any thoughts about that for babies and toddlers.
Mm-hmm. A very important topic, but not one that we cover extensively in the book. We do talk actually a little bit about the gut-brain connection and the relationship between autonomic dysfunction and things like inflammatory bowel. But that is really a topic that would be sort of its own major, not necessarily book, but chapter or whatever. So this was, there are many aspects of autonomic dysfunction that are related to the chronic conditions that are treated so often. People are starting to write about them. Steve Porges is starting to write about them. but not covered extensively in this book. Was there I saw there was just looking here. Oh, okay. Yes, somebody is correcting me that Asian men are persons of color. So I apologize for that. But certainly the overrepresentation of Asians relative to the populations served, I think, is probably the what's very much more to the point. There's another question here.
Yes, it was in the chat. Someone has asked if you made any original discoveries that you write about in the book, or is this really an overview of the polyvagal theory and its applications?
Oh, wow. Any original discoveries? Yes, I think, and I don't know that I would call it a discovery in the scientific sense, but certainly working with George was such a gift to me, because our work has much more in common than I would have thought. And the work that he did in the book, talking about the polyvagal informed organization, how to build it, how to train staff, how to support staff, was very impactful for me and really transformational, I think, in many ways. So that was sort of my own discovery. This is a book that is based upon both the research that have been done by others. It's heavily referenced. Don't let that scare you. I've been told by many people who are not physicians that it's very accessible, but it's evidence-based. And what we have tried to do is take the evidence as it exists in 2020 and 2021 even, and help people understand both the theory itself and its application to children and their families.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sanders. There's another question along that line, which is, will your book describe a child's behaviors and where they are in regards to the polyvagal and their tone, and actually offer intervention or guidance on how to proceed with that child?
Yes, I can say a hearty yes to that. And it does it in many different ways.
Yes, it does.
Kate brought up the question of, or the issue of transdisciplinary involvement. We talk about things like, what are the ideal types of settings in which children and families are cared for, and how the very rich opportunities when you bring a number of child-serving professionals into a room to talk about, for example, a particular child with a particular set of issues, can bring solutions to light that nobody ever would have had independently. And that's actually one of the chapters that I like the most. We also talk very specifically, and we use a number of different vignettes throughout the book that cover the classroom, that cover mental health, that cover hospital settings, just a number of different opportunities to look at how children might be challenged in particular situations, and how both the child's caregivers can be supported using a polyvagal lens, as well as how the professional caregivers can be supported. So, for example, one of the little vignettes in the chapter that George wrote on the polyvagal informed organization talks about a situation where a young woman who hopes to have a career in child mental health blows it when she's working with a kid. The kid gets dysregulated, she gets dysregulated in return, the whole thing explodes. And George does a beautiful job of painting this picture of how does the more senior clinician both support the needs of the child and supports this young staff member he has who's very well intended and just got overwhelmed. So there's a lot of that in the book. That was one of the things that was actually the most fun about writing the book.
Thank you. Amber, did you want to ask your question?
Yes, I have cerebral palsy, and I was born in the 1970s when there was no surfactant. And I was born at 29 weeks. And I am just curious because I have a lot of recent, in the last 2 years, I have a lot of motility issues, pelvic floor dysfunction is what they're labeling it, and IBS, but a lot of GI pain and things like that. So I know it's connected. I just don't know how to find the right professional to get treatment for the different components that are going on. But I'm sure, is that common? Do you see that a lot later on in life? I have always had constipation issues since I was born. But I know that's not typical of everybody with cerebral palsy. So I'm just curious because I have friends that also have CP and are about the same age, and they're having very similar issues. So anything in the book that would help with that, or maybe you have other resources you could get to me at some other time.
Sure. There are a couple of references in the book on the relationship between IBS and autonomic dysfunction. And if you would provide Kate with your email, I can also perhaps put you in touch with some gastroenterologists who might be able to help you find practitioners who would be able to assist you. I think that in a nutshell, there's a fair amount of work now going on using vagal stimulation to address autonomic dysfunction in gut disorders. It's a burgeoning topic. So please, if Kate doesn't have your email, please make sure she gets it.
Okay,
hang on, I lost you. Let me move. Yeah, I will make sure I get that to her. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Now, does anyone else have a question? Because I definitely could ask more questions.
I still have a question, Kate. I was
Sheila?
if you allow me to say it. How many large university hospitals where you might, or large organizations might be polyvagal organizations, and is there a certifying board like there was in mother baby friendly hospitals to get polyvagal friendly certification?
So the answer to that is that this is a developing field. So I am actually participating in and leading a group of academic physicians who are trying to think about how we can get polyvagal theory into neuroscience curricula and humanities curricula in medical schools. To my knowledge, there are no large university medical hospitals that are polyvagal informed. There are some mental health institutions that are polyvagal informed, some in England and some in Arizona. And I'm trying to think, what was the last portion of that, Sheila?
Yeah, you've already answered it.
Okay.
Is there a
Oh, the certifying.
A certifying, or is there somebody that I can send? I don't even know who I would be sending, but there's going to be they're building a large mother baby hospital here as part of a university hospital system. And I think they need to be in contact with somebody that says, yes, I can give a speech, or you can go here and read this book, and
So I do a lot of lecturing. Where do you live? Which university hospital?
It's University Hospitals of Cleveland.
Of Cleveland. Okay.
Mhm.
So, all right. And is that Case Western?
That's Case Western, yep.
Okay.
Ahuja Medical Center.
Pardon me?
Ahuja Medical Center.
Okay. So what I would say is that the Polyvagal Institute, which Steve Porges has founded, is developing a certification process. And there are, I mean, I'm available to lecture. There are others who are available to lecture as well. There's actually a nice core group of physicians now who have interest in this area. We have neonatologists, we have anesthesiologists, we have family practice docs. So I believe that there is a momentum starting. I wish I could say we're at a tipping point, but there is a momentum starting.
Great. Thanks. Thanks for your efforts, Doctor.
You're very welcome.
Okay, so I'm going to steer us back. We only have about 12 minutes left. I wanted to talk with you a little bit about something that you said in the book about the caravans passageway, the
Yeah.
resource and risk
Mhm.
caravan passageway, which was a term I first heard being used at the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard. And I also would like to couple that with the idea of buffering protection. So I'm wondering if you could walk us through
Sure.
those two they're like vectors or passageways or ways that we can recognize when what are those ingredients that would make us more resilient, and what are those which would truly put us at risk in our nervous systems?
Sure. So the caravans of risk and resource passageways are concepts that come from the sociology literature. And as you can imagine, as soon as I read about them, it made perfect sense to me. And the premise is the following, that there are some situations, some children for whom everything lines up and all the resources are in place to support optimal development. A lot of this relates to social determinants, but not exclusively to social determinants of health. And then there are others, sadly, for whom things don't line up. And there is simply one risk factor after another, after another, after another. And so the question really is, for those children who have caravans of resource passageways, God bless them, God bless their families. That's a wonderful thing. Those children are typically well scaffolded. They become resilient. They are securely attached. They can handle novelty. The world is their oyster, COVID aside. So, how COVID impacts somebody who has benefited from a caravan of resource passageways, I think is probably a topic of its own. On the other hand, for those children who have one impediment after another, can those children become resilient? Of course they can. Of course they can. Because in that situation, and I have an example I use in the book. It's not any child I've ever known, but it's just a child that I made up of a child who's born to a woman who is dependent on opiates, and she's born premature, and her mother's not a part of her life, and it's just one thing after another. But she's lucky, because it turns out when the Department of Children and Families does their research, they find that the mother has a sister who lives in another city, who's raised her own children, and is interested in raising this little girl, whom I named Julia. And so the aunt brings Julia into her home. And, at first when Julia comes into her home as a child who's been exposed to opiates, as you can imagine, she's irritable, she's fretful, she doesn't sleep well. But gradually over a period of time, in her aunt's loving care, this stuff begins to dissipate. And as she gets a little older, her aunt actually decides that she really wants to be a foster to adopt family. And she is in the process, and I'm sorry, this doesn't necessarily end so happily the way I wrote it. But when Julia's 4 years old and she's well attached, and the aunt is getting ready to adopt her, the aunt is killed in a car accident. So the question then becomes, because now Julia started off with a caravan of risk passageways. She fortunately was taken into the home of this loving aunt who nurtured her. And at 4 years of age, she has this good attachment to this woman she calls mommy. So the question is, what happens now? Because you could imagine that being securely attached to her aunt, if she's fortunate enough and there's another family member or a foster family or someone who can provide that kind of scaffolding after a period of time of grief, she should do well. She should do well. If, on the other hand, she ends up in the foster care system going from home to home, you've got a caravan of risk passageways again. So these things are not immutable. And that's the most important thing. Biology is not destiny, right?
Mhm. Right.
So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's, for me, it's a really helpful framework. And that's even putting aside the epigenetic influences, okay? Because then when you layer epigenetics on top of it, you've got yet another whole kind of series of
Yeah.
influencers. So
And yeah, the transgenerational aspect.
Mhm.
Could I ask you a question that I get asked a lot, Dr. Sanders, with the COVID-19? Are those of us who work with babies and families really who have to wear masks, is that really affecting our human development? This idea of how mask wearing affecting the social engagement, learning in our youngest population?
Well, of course it is. The question is, what are we going to do about it?
Mhm.
So it's very clear. It's clear on a one-to-one basis, and I'm sure it will be clear as people start moving away from COVID. It's one of these risk-benefit analyses, right? I mean, we as professional caregivers have to have masks on to protect ourselves and to protect these children, because none of us knows, even if we're vaccinated, we could get a breakthrough infection, for example. But the question is, A, having a mask on doesn't mean you cannot engage someone. So you still have your eyes. People can still see through your mask that you are smiling, and you have your voice. So what you do then, I think, is you capitalize on those things that you can use. And certainly, parents in the NICU, unfortunately, are masking with their children. I am sure that there will be downstream effects of those things. But there is a lifetime of opportunity there after they leave the NICU. And the well-scaffolded baby who is skin to skin on mom's chest for hours a day is getting something they need very much.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sanders. People want to know where they can get a copy of your book, and can I get it signed? I don't know if you're doing anything like that.
Well, let's put it this way. You can get my book at either Amazon or Norton. And if you want to go to the trouble of sending a book to me at my academic address, I will sign it and send it back to you. I mean, what can I say? It's a lot of trouble to go to, but I'd be more than happy to do it if that's, and I can give Kate my academic address. So
Yeah, I'll distribute it with this recording to everybody. If they want to get a signed copy, they'll send you the book.
lovely.
Yeah. And so just a few final questions. There is another question here about cerebral palsy. So Alice, do you want to just come on, open your microphone and ask your question?
I'm reading, yeah, I'm reading it.
Okay.
I mean, yes, this could be very much a dorsal vagal response, a collapsing response. And there's actually been some literature written about that as well. So I can only imagine the challenges. And I would suggest that this person try to bring up with her treating physician the possibility that there is some autonomic dysfunction associated with this. There's vagal stimulation devices that are available. They need to be, I think, used in the context of being with a skilled practitioner. But I think we're going to hear more and more about this over the years.
She was actually in her power wheelchair going down a hill in a very scary, and she had one of these episodes. Now, she wasn't alone, but the person she was with also had a disability. And I mean, so the dangers are huge, you know, because she's very out in the world in this power chair.
Yes, they are. But I do think the good news about this, and I think people are going to start writing more about this. Steve Porges has started writing about it, this relationship between vagal dysfunction and a whole host of, you know, things like, quote, neurogenic seizures, that type of thing.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
Well, thank you, Alice, and thank you, Dr. Sanders. And people are excited to read your book. They've been posting. Sounds interesting and valuable.
Thank you.
So thank you for coming on and sharing with us. And I don't know if there's any last burning question, but if not, we'll just say a good night to Dr. Sanders. Anyone need anything?
Well, thank you to everyone. I encourage you, I'll just put up my, there's an email address in my website. Please go on my website. Let me know what you think about it. It's been really fun to write it, to develop it, and be in touch.
Yes, I highly recommend Dr. Sanders as a speaker. She's been a wonderful part of our online learning system here at the Pre and Perinatal Healing Online. So
thank you so much, Kate. You've been wonderful to me.
Yeah, it's been great, and to be continued, because I do believe we have more to do together, Dr. Sanders.
Yes, we
do. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. Feel free to just turn on your microphone and say goodbye as you head out the door so we can hear your voice. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders.
Thank you, Dr. Sanders.
Thank you, Dr.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you.